There is a word hiding inside certain family names. Not a metaphor, not a legend passed down at dinner tables. An actual fossil of language, sitting quietly inside a surname, waiting 3,000 years to be noticed. Most people who carry these names have no idea what they are holding. They know the name as identity, as inheritance, as something written on a passport. What they do not know is that a handful of Lebanese surnames appear to preserve, almost intact, the occupational and geographic fingerprints of the very network that once moved purple dye, cedar wood, glass, and alphabets across the ancient Mediterranean. The Phoenician trade world. This is not a story about a single lost tribe. It is a story about how a language can survive the empire that spoke it, how a coastline can imprint itself onto a bloodline of names, and how 13 surnames, some common, some rare, some nearly extinct, appear to trace back to the ports, workshops, and temples of a civilization historians once assumed had vanished without a trace. The official story said the Phoenicians disappeared. The names suggest otherwise. For most of modern history, the Phoenicians were treated as a footnote. Traders, not builders. Merchants, not civilization makers. They left behind purple cloth and an alphabet, and then, according to the standard narrative, they were absorbed, first by the Persians, then the Greeks, then Rome, then successive waves of conquest that swept the eastern Mediterranean for 2,000 years. Language changed. Religion changed. Empires rose and fell across the same 20 miles of coastline. By the time genealogists and historians began seriously studying the region now called Lebanon, the working assumption was simple. Whatever the Phoenicians once were, culturally speaking, was gone. This made sense on paper. Phoenician as a spoken language did fade. Phoenician city-states did fall. The temples were repurposed, the ports were rebuilt, the old gods were replaced. If you were looking for a nation, an army, or a bloodline that stayed pure and separate for 3 millennia, you would not find one. That story really is over. But surnames do not behave like empires. They do not need armies to survive. They only need someone, somewhere, to keep calling the blacksmith's son, the blacksmith's son. And that is where the first crack in the old assumption appears. Linguists working on Levantine Arabic noticed something that did not quite fit the timeline. A cluster of family names common in coastal Lebanese towns did not match the expected pattern of Arabic-origin surnames formed after the 7th century Islamic expansion. Some carried root structures that looked older. Some referred to trades, dyeing, metalwork, shipbuilding, using terms that seemed to predate the occupational vocabulary imported later by Arab administrators. Others were not occupational at all. They were simply the old city names themselves, worn down by centuries of pronunciation, still functioning as someone's last name. That was the anomaly, not proof, not a headline, just a pattern that refused to sit quietly inside the accepted timeline. This is where genetics entered the conversation and where the story stopped being purely about language. Researchers studying Y chromosome DNA, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son across generations, began sampling populations across the Mediterranean coastline, including modern Lebanon, in an effort to trace ancient population movement. Y-DNA is useful here because it survives migration events with relatively little disruption along the paternal line, which made it a natural tool for testing whether a genetic signature associated with the ancient Levantine coast could still be detected in men living in the same region today. One coordinated research effort, associated with the National Geographic Genographic Project and led in part by Lebanese-American geneticist Pierre Zalou, examined this question directly. The researchers were not simply asking whether Lebanese populations had ancient roots. That was assumed. They were asking something sharper. Could a specific genetic marker, consistent with the ancient population base of the Phoenician homeland, be traced not only within Lebanon, but across former Phoenician trade colonies scattered around the Mediterranean, from Cyprus and Sicily to coastal North Africa and southern Spain? If stories like this fascinate you, the kind where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, this is a good moment to subscribe, because history keeps hiding things exactly like this in plain sight. What the researchers found did not simply confirm the old assumption that the Phoenicians vanished. It complicated it in a much more interesting way. The genetic signal did not stay neatly inside Lebanon's modern borders. It appeared, at low but consistent frequencies, in populations along the old Phoenician trade arteries, cities that had been colonies, ports, and trading posts more than 2,500 years ago. That was not supposed to happen if the Phoenicians had simply been absorbed and erased. A trading network does not leave genetic echoes in foreign harbors unless people, not just goods, moved along those routes and stayed. The story did not collapse under this evidence. It widened. At this point, 3 explanations were on the table, and no single one was strong enough to close the case. The first explanation treated the shared genetic signal as background noise, a marker so ancient and so widespread across the broader Near East that its presence in trade cities could simply reflect deep shared ancestry across the whole Eastern Mediterranean, with no need for any specific Phoenician-era movement at all. The second explanation took the opposite position, that Phoenician sailors, merchants, and colonists genuinely settled in these port cities during the height of their trading dominance, intermarried with local populations, and left a measurable, if diluted, genetic trace that persisted for millennia. The third explanation sat between the two, proposing that later waves of Mediterranean contact, trade, and conquest, occurring long after the Phoenician period itself, may have repeatedly reintroduced similar genetic lineages from the same coastal source region, making it difficult to isolate the Phoenician era specifically from everything that came after it. Researchers were careful here, and rightly so. A shared genetic marker is not a passport stamp. It cannot, by itself, prove that a specific person's ancestors stood on a specific dock in Tyre in 800 BCE and boarded a specific ship. What it can do is show that the population history of the region is layered in a way that a simple Phoenicians vanished narrative cannot account for. There is also a deeper tension running underneath all 3 explanations, one that geneticists are careful to flag rather than resolve. Y chromosome evidence only follows the paternal line, father to son, in an unbroken thread stretching back through time. It says nothing about the maternal side of the family tree, which may carry an entirely different history of movement, mixing, and origin. A population's genome is never a single story. It is at least 2 stories, sometimes moving together, sometimes pulling in different directions, and the loudest signal in the data is not always the most representative one. This is part of why researchers involved in the Genographic Project's Mediterranean work describe their findings in careful, conditional language, as evidence consistent with a Phoenician-era dispersal, not as final proof of one. Later research using broader genome-wide data, rather than Y chromosome markers alone, has added further nuance, suggesting that the ancestry of modern Levantine populations reflects multiple layers of contact stretching back thousands of years before the Phoenician period even began, with the Bronze Age trading world sitting on top of a much older regional foundation rather than replacing it. That detail matters, because it reframes the entire question. The Phoenicians were never a population that appeared from nowhere. They were themselves the product of a much older Levantine lineage, one that archaeologists and geneticists now trace back through the Canaanite Bronze Age and beyond. What made them historically distinct was not a separate bloodline, it was what they built with the one they already had. A script, a trade network, and a maritime reach that turned a modest stretch of coastline into one of the ancient world's most influential civilizations. Any genetic or onomastic trace of Phoenician ancestry, then, is really a trace of continuity, a population that kept living on the same coast, through empire after empire, long before and long after the Phoenician name itself was ever used by outsiders to describe them. This is where the surnames become genuinely useful, not as proof, but as a second, independent line of evidence pointing in a similar direction. Consider the name Sabah. In Arabic, it means the dyer. On its own, an occupational surname proves nothing extraordinary. Dyeing cloth was a common trade across the ancient world. But this particular dye trade was not generic. The eastern Mediterranean coast, and specifically the cities of Tyre and Sidon, were the historical source of Tyrian purple, a dye so rare and labor-intensive to produce from a species of sea snail that it became the exclusive color of royalty and imperial power for over 1,000 years. A surname meaning the dyer concentrated precisely along the coastline where that dye was invented and monopolized, is not conclusive. But it is not nothing either. Consider Hadad, the blacksmith. Metalworking sustained the shipbuilding and weapons trade that made Phoenician naval dominance possible in the first place. Consider Najjar, the carpenter, in a region whose entire commercial identity was built on cedar wood, a resource so valuable it was exported to Egyptian pharaohs for temple construction and funerary ships. A carpenter's surname on this coastline is not decoration. It is a job description for an industry that once defined the ancient world's shipping lanes. Then there are the names that are not occupations at all, but geography wearing a disguise. Suri, a surname still found among Lebanese families, appears to derive from Sour, the Arabic name for the ancient city of Tyre itself, one of the two most powerful Phoenician trading capitals. Sidawi similarly traces to Sidon, Tyre's great sister city and rival. Jbaili traces to Jbail, the Arabic name for Byblos, the city so central to the ancient book and papyrus trade that the Greek word for book, biblion, and by extension the word Bible, is thought by many linguists to derive from its name. A surname, in these cases, is not describing a trade. It is describing a hometown that happened to be one of the most important port cities in the ancient world. A hometown whose name outlived the empire that built it. Reyes, meaning captain or chief, carried particular weight along a coastline where ship captains were not simply laborers but men of considerable status, entrusted with cargo, crew, and the safe navigation of trade routes stretching from the Levant to the far edges of the known Mediterranean. Bazi, linked to the word for merchant, and Trabelsi, tied to the northern port city of Tripoli, extend the same pattern outward, a family name doubling as a coordinate on an ancient trading map. Zayat, the oil merchant, reflects the olive oil economy that fed and financed Levantine trade fleets for centuries. Bari, of the sea, needs no further explanation. And Canaan, is perhaps the most direct of them all, not a trade, not a city, but the ancestral name of the land itself. The term used before Phoenician was even coined by outside observers, preserved as a personal surname carried by living families today. Two further names round out the picture, each carrying a slightly different kind of clue. Malof, meaning roughly the accustomed or the familiar, is thought by some regional linguists to trace to a family designation used for households with long-standing residence and standing in a given trading town, the kind of designation that only makes sense in a society organized, at least in part, around commercial reputation and continuity across generations. Chidiac, rarer still, has been linked by some genealogists to Old Aramaic Syriac vocabulary tied to weighing and measuring, functions that would have been essential to any port handling foreign cargo, currency, and trade agreements. Neither claim is settled. Both belong cautiously to the same pattern as the rest. Individually, each of these names could be dismissed as coincidence or as a later Arabic language description that simply happened to reuse old vocabulary. Names are not DNA. A surname can be adopted, changed, translated, or assigned centuries after the fact, and Lebanon's surname history, like most of the Levant's, includes waves of Ottoman administration, French colonial record-keeping, and religious conversion, any of which could reshape a family name without touching ancestry at all. But researchers studying the region have noted something worth sitting with: the geographic clustering. These particular surnames do not appear evenly distributed across Lebanon. They concentrate, disproportionately, in the same coastal towns that were once the Phoenician port cities themselves: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Tripoli, Beirut's Old Harbor District. The names did not scatter randomly across the landscape. They stayed close to the water. That is not a contradiction of the genetic findings. It is a second signal, pointing in roughly the same direction, from an entirely different discipline. What begins to emerge is not a single dramatic revelation, but something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. A picture of a population that was never erased so much as absorbed into new religions, new languages, and new political identities, while certain threads of occupation, geography, and lineage kept resurfacing in the names people gave their children, generation after generation, without anyone necessarily intending to preserve anything at all. Picture the coastline itself for a moment. Not as a line on a map, but as it would have looked at dusk, 3,000 years ago. The harbor at Tyre crowded with cedar-hulled ships, their holds packed with murex shells and ingots and rolls of dyed cloth, the air thick with brine and crushed shellfish and wood smoke from 100 dye vats along the shore. Men calling to each other in a language that has not been spoken aloud by anyone alive for well over 1,000 years. Somewhere in that crowd, a dyer, a carpenter, a ship's captain giving orders before the tide turns. None of them could have known that some fragment of what they were, not their words, not their gods, not their empire, but simply what they did for a living and where they were from, might still be legible, faintly, in the names their descendants would carry into an entirely different world. That is the part the old story missed. It assumed that when a civilization's language dies and its temples fall, the people themselves dissolve into whatever comes next, leaving nothing behind but ruins for archaeologists to catalog. But population history rarely works in such clean breaks. People do not vanish when empires fall. They convert, they intermarry, they adopt new languages and new gods, and they keep having children who inherit both genes and, sometimes, names, sometimes without anyone along the way realizing what thread they were continuing. The genome and the surname are telling something close to the same story from two different directions, and neither one is claiming certainty. The genetic data cannot prove that any single family descends directly from a Phoenician trader. The surname evidence cannot prove it either. What both point toward, cautiously, is a regional continuity, a population that has occupied this stretch of coastline for an extraordinarily long time, absorbing outside influence again and again without being fully replaced by it. If your own family carries one of these names, that is not a certificate of Phoenician royalty, and no serious researcher would frame it that way. It is something more interesting than a certificate. It is a reminder that identity is rarely a single clean line traced back to one dramatic ancestor. It is layered, contested, partially preserved, and partially reinvented, closer to sediment than to a signature. If you want more stories where a name, a bone, or a strand of DNA quietly rewrites what we thought we knew about a people, subscribe, because the past keeps leaving fingerprints in places no one thought to check. The Phoenicians were never simply erased. They were folded into everything that came after them: Roman Berytus, Byzantine Christianity, Islamic administration, Ottoman rule, and the modern Lebanese state. And in that folding, most of what made them distinct disappeared from the visible record. But not all of it. Somewhere in a dye-stained workshop's memory, in a captain's title, in a city's old name still clinging to a family, something survived that no conquest managed to fully erase. The map that once declared them gone was never wrong about the empire. It was only wrong about the people. And that, in the end, may be the truest thing DNA and language have taught us about any vanished civilization. They rarely vanish completely. They just stop being visible to those who are not looking closely enough.